Hey you guys, what's up? I'm Ashley from heavenathome.org, and this is the Heaven at Home podcast, where my goal is to encourage you in your personal growth journey while being open, honest, and owning my story. We have faith-based conversations and tackle a bunch of different tough topics. Check out the description to follow me and learn more. Remember, you are fully known and deeply loved. Let's do this. Hey you guys, so I have a feeling I'm going to put this out and then regret not taking the time to make this one a video episode, because I'm literally going to narrate how I'm perceiving this video in real time. But this episode is basically like, you are my sheep. And if the shoe fits, wear it, because I know that some people could be listening to this and this might not be where you are, in your journey or in your faith journey, and that's perfectly fine. But if this is for you, it's for you. I came across this video on Facebook, but it's a video of, I'm not exactly completely sure of the context, but there's this group of people. They're in front of a flock of sheep. They're, kind of grazing off in the distance, right? And they're doing this test where I want to say like maybe 2 or 3 people seem to be yelling this command to the sheep, like, come, like, come over here. And the sheep are not responding at all. Like, they're going about their business. They're not even stopping for the loud, obnoxious people yelling at them. Like, they're going about their lives like nothing is happening at all. There's like one woman that goes, and then another person goes, and then a man goes, and they're all, it seems like they're shouting come, like trying to get the sheep to come over to them. And like I said, complete indifference, complete nonchalant, no response, no signal that they even heard the voice of the people literally shouting at them to come over. And then the video continues, and the farmer is like kind of messing around. Like if everyone before the farmer was giving the command to like come over here, the farmer makes like a different signal with his voice, like almost kind of messing around, like, and just at the sound of his voice, the sheep, or some sheep here and there, like they stop what they're doing, they look up, they turn over to look at the farmer. And then they start like all shuffling and heading over to him by the time that he's saying to come. So I found that so interesting, that different strangers, and I shared this on my stories earlier this year. I want to say it was like maybe February or something. And, different people are saying the command to come. Like there is a command to come that's literally verbally being said to some extent. Like, I'm not a farmer, so I have like no experience with this, but as far as I can understand, the command is explicit, but it's coming from a stranger's voice, so it's nothing, right? And I found it so interesting that before the farmer decided to give a command that kind of calls over these sheep to come over, he's just messing around. Like, instead of just going straight to like, hey, come over here, and them immediately coming, he's like, oh, hey, what's up, blah, 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 just shouting. Like, I don't know what it was exactly that he was saying. It sounded like a different language or whatever. But just messing around with his voice and just shouting like kind of carelessly, meaninglessly. The sheep are already responding. They're pausing. They're looking up. They're looking over. They're shifting their posture, right? So you can tell that there is a like physical response to just the sound of the shepherd's voice, right? And then he gives a command to come, and they all come quickly. Like they start moving over to him in his direction quickly, like urgently. And it was actually like kind of beautiful, the illustration that we have. So I want to go to the Bible really quick because Jesus makes that comparison. Let's see. There's John chapter 10, verse 14. It says, I am the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd, as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. In the same way, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. I think there's another variation of this. John 10:27, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. John 10 verse 4, when he has brought them out, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. I just actually seeing the video of sheep responding to their shepherd, it was actually like kind of beautiful. Like it made me feel almost like cheerful, like giddy. It was just so, I found it adorable how quickly the sheep like went over to him, and to me that was like really endearing. And along the lines of this whole thing, I feel like in every season of life, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm the kind of person that cares very much about like my heart posture. And even when I'm doing a good thing, I make sure that I'm doing it for the right reasons. And I feel like that level of authenticity kind of takes people back sometimes. Like even if I know someone doesn't like me, I'm still going to go out of my way to be kind and respectful. And it, you know, it's just uncommon for that kind of behavior. And even when I'm doing something kind, I'm making sure that there's no ulterior motives. There's no self-seeking purpose here. When I'm going like out of my way to serve somebody, you know, same thing, just making sure that there's no, you know, no pride or like just trying to be selfless. Like I'm really big on heart posture, doing things for the right reasons, loving from a complete and whole unconditional place without always expecting something in return. And in the same token, you know, like on the flip side, just also trying to make sure that I am setting like good boundaries and having respect for myself and seeing the value in myself, because I'm also big on trying to be, when I was a kid, I was a really, really prideful person. I was very self-centered, self-seeking. You know, I wanted to be the center of attention. And then I think I encountered God, and I was like, I actually really don't, you know, I don't want to be famous. I don't want to attract notice. I didn't like my hair being too curly because I feel like really big curly hair attracted attention. Like it was like almost like I overcorrected, and all of a sudden like this is kind of who I am now. But even on that sense, like I try to balance that out and be like, no, like, okay, for example, I had this thought the other day. I am replaceable. You know, I am okay with that. I'm okay with being replaced. There are attributes and characteristics of my personality, as, you know, as a wife, as a mom, as a woman, as a, how would I say that? Like as a volunteer, as a worship leader, like I can be replaced, and I'm okay with that. In the same token, there's a part of me that also knows that I'm irreplaceable. Like there are parts of my, my spiritual value, my emotional value, my practical value that other people don't have to offer. Or maybe it's like a combination of all these unique things about me that makes me irreplaceable. Like at the end of the day, in this time and place, in this generation, in this world, for all time, like there's no one else who is me. Like I'm the only me there is, right? And so I'm always like trying to balance this this heart posture of not being to this or to that, but always being balanced. And sometimes that involves like personal correction. And then even like with your thoughts, like taking your thoughts captive and stuff. Anyway, I'm saying all this to kind of give some context to the fact that there are things internally, there are things within us, our own voice that has to be mitigated, right? When we're going about our lives. But there's also external voices. There's the voices of our friends, our family, our mentors, our community, our tribe of people. And then there are spiritual voices. There's the voice of the enemy. And then there's the voice of God. And I'll never forget this. because I grew up in church, but I can say very certainly that for a long time I was most familiar with the enemy's voice. So much so that I think the enemy's voice was even louder than my own voice. There were often thoughts where, like, you're not good enough. You're not a good person. You're not inherently good. Like, you are not meant to be a Christian. You're meant to go to hell. That's just who you are. You might as well just accept it. And I would have like nightmares and just like a whole bunch of stuff. That's kind of more in terms of like the spiritual warfare kind of thing. But I never really truly realized how tuned in I was to the voice of the enemy until I realized, number one, that I can hear the voice of God, that it's possible to hear the voice of God, that I can have access to God like that. I never realized how tuned in I was to the voice of the enemy until I started pursuing God for myself. And then I had to separate and differentiate. This is the enemy's voice here. This is what the enemy says. And then occasions where I'm like, this is me agreeing with one voice or another voice. Like, this is me agreeing with what the enemy is saying. So I have to stop my agreement. I have to correct my thought. I have to correct my emotional response, stuff like that. And then, or even if, I'm in a conversation with someone, right? And they're saying, you know what, I can actually see you making this mistake in the future. Or I think you're always going to be this kind of person. If I agree with that, I'm like, okay, this is the voice of another person. Am I agreeing or am I disagreeing in my heart? Am I going to let that, define my course for the future? That type of thing, right? And in the last several years pretty much since 2019, there's always been a voice speaking into my life. And one of the things I was constantly struggling with was whether or not I'm going to stay. And so I'm kind of gonna go into like some personal stories here and there in sharing this, just to kind of give like some practical application here. And then hopefully I can tie a pretty bow around everything and make everything make sense. But there was a time where if you've listened to any of my podcasts before, you'll know that one of the things I say, especially when I'm trying to make a decision or like establish what my priority is, I'll ask myself, what do I want and what do I want most? And so from 2019 to 2021, I have a lot of natural tendencies to try to avoid pain, to shut down pain, to mitigate, minimize, suppress pain, or, like deal with it as much as possible, right? But in a very real sense, trying to manage it all in a way where I could survive was kind of like a lot. Like, it was affecting my mental health, my emotional health, and my physical health, like literally my physical health. And so even while ultimately my goal was to stay and to be present and to be faithful, I noticed different parts of me breaking under pressure. And so I remember in October 2019, I physically left where I was and I went to go spend time with my friends and family in Florida. And then I did the same thing in, I want to say 2021 for a couple months. I had a really, really great, strong support system in 2020 during the pandemic for the most part. But in 2021, I did the same thing and I ended up leaving for a couple months to go see my friends and family, find some relief. I had some things coming up on heart scans and at that point, there were already prescriptions and counselors and doctor's appointments and all this stuff. So ultimately though, all with the intention of staying. So although I'm like taking physical, actual breaks and, taking time to be with loved ones, people who love me, my big goal was to stay. And throughout that time, my intentions were clear even when my feelings were confused. I was uncomfortable. I was in pain. I was going through it. Like, it was not easy for me. And every part of me ultimately wanted to go permanently, but I stayed and I remained, right? And then in 2022, it was almost like staying doesn't make sense anymore. Staying doesn't make sense. Believing God doesn't make sense. Valuing promises that God made that were conditional based on our obedience and our submission to Him, that didn't make sense. Like, still holding those things dear, still, sorting through all those details with God, holding on to things that He said to me in the context of everything that's going on. That didn't make sense, right? And so life at this point, in addition to my feelings, is saying, okay, time to go, right? And then there's the people who love me and the people who care about me and the people who would fight for me. And they're like, yeah, time to go, time to leave. But for some reason, I never felt freedom from God to go. And so a lot of times what I would tell people, friends and family, when they would be like, you should go back home. You should be with your friends and family. And you should do what's best for you. Like, finally, you should do that. And I agreed with that in a very practical sense. Like, it is literally good for me. That was literally why I had to take breaks to like refresh my soul and all this stuff. And they would say stuff like that. And I'd be like, no, but this is what God said. This is like the last thing that God said to me. And even if it doesn't apply as much, I still want to be faithful to the last thing that God said. And ultimately, I had no real vision for God's purpose in my life if I moved. It's hard to really put into words that kind of conviction, but that was my reasoning. And I'm like, no, I feel like I'm supposed to stay. And even when the details of staying got more and more specific, like, okay, stay in North Carolina, stay in Charlotte, stay in this church, stay in that church, like that whole thing, there was just a lot of me looking in God's direction. And when it didn't make sense to other people and it didn't really make sense to me, I was kind of okay just knowing, like, I feel like I'm obeying and remaining here, even though it's painful, even though it's like forcing me to be uncomfortable, even though it's taxing, it's weighty, and it's difficult. I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do, right? And I never really felt any release to like expand my world or my community or anything like that until December of last year, which was December 2023. So we'll get into that in a second. But people would ask me like, why are you staying in this context? And I'd be like, because it's what God wants. And even though like I'm saying all this in full awareness that it's not exactly what I want. It's not exactly what's best for me, but that would be my answer because it's not what God wants. God wants me here, so I'm going to stay here. And people would be like, oh, but like it might be easier for you if you just leave a little bit. It might be easier for you if you just shift a little bit. If you just move 1 degree over, 2 degrees over, like maybe that will help you because you're struggling like weekly. You're struggling like regularly. And So, sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. Okay, yeah, so, but that was ultimately my resolve. Literally everyone in my circle would ask me that question. And even though I didn't fully understand why, I knew what to do. And one of the things I've realized in this process was that God really did sustain me. If you guys listened to the episode before this, like, God really did sustain me. He really did hold me. He really did carry me. He comforted me. He was present with me. He was there for me in the way that I needed him in order to obey. Like, to me, that is his grace and his mercy empowering me to hold true to something I literally did not want. But I've also come to know that God is not a robot. And he is responsive to me. He is responsive to my prayers. Not all of them, but he is responsive. He does take time out to answer me. He does take time out to comfort me, to set me on the right track. He convicts me, he disciplines me, but he also guides me and directs me. And so I was kind of noticing that in December last year. Well, really, I feel like God really started dealing with me personally from August to December of 2023 and speaking to me a lot about moving and family, and those promises attached to those things I'm going to keep personal. I'm keeping those very, very personal. But it got to a point where I was like, God, I've done this and I've obeyed, and I've done the best I can with what I have, knowing that I didn't do it perfectly. Like, there were times where I needed to apologize, times I needed to repent, even in the middle of being hurt and offended and rejected. Like, I have not done this perfectly, but I've done this the best I can. And I've done all of this without any vision for the future. When I think about year after year after year, all I see is darkness. And my vision and my dreams were stolen from me in October 2019. Like, I've done all of this day by day with you. And I can't do it anymore. I'm tired. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. And I'm doing all of this genuinely. Like, there is no part of me that is faking this process. Like, I am literally walking through this, right? And so I started having conversations with God about moving. And I was very open. Like, I was very straightforward. I was very direct. I was like, either you're going to supernaturally heal me emotionally, because I've seen you do that before, or you're going to give me permission to leave. It's going to be one of the two, right? And so at this point, like, I'm sharing these conversations with my close friends. Like, and when I say close, it's really only like my mom and probably my cousin. And I was seeking God in that process, because I'm like, I just gave God an ultimatum. That's not usually the way to go, but I'm speaking to him as a father, and I'm being honest about where I'm at. And I had this kind of, it wasn't prideful, but it was like a secure, confident attitude that I can be forthcoming with God. And even that, though, there was this moment, like, I'm confiding in my people. I'm saying, like, hey guys, I'm thinking about moving. I'm thinking about doing something that's best for me. And of course they would agree, because that's something that they've been saying. That is something that they've said before, right? And they've known for a long time that my conviction was that if God is saying to stay, then I'm going to stay. And if he doesn't tell me to go, like, I'm not going. Like, it is what it is. And they're obviously supporting my choices, right? But then I think it was December 10th was a Sunday, right? And I have made known my request to God. Like, I have spoken to him very, very directly. And on December 10th, 2023, around the time where my prayers have like started shifting and stuff, there was a sermon on obedience. And I remember having this deep impression of like obedience to the point of sacrifice, right? And so while I'm wrestling in my personal time with God, saying like either you do this or that, like one or the other, I had this conviction over my prayer, and I just remember God tenderly dealing with me on that Sunday. And I was, if you guys could probably like pull up the video if you want to. But I was in the front row. I think I was like trying to take a video, and then all of a sudden I feel the Holy Spirit like speaking into me, and I was at the altar already, because again, I'm in the front seat, and I just like curled over, and I was on the floor, and kind of like in the fetal position, but like, how do I say that? Like head to the floor, knees to the floor, like I'm on the floor, basically. God is dealing with me. And it was almost like, how do I describe this? I almost felt like God was saying, if I asked you to obey me again, will you obey me? And this is something that, you know, this was an occurrence for me somewhat annually, where like I would feel like God is telling me to stay or to be present. And he asked me that question. Like, if I tell you, if I make my will known, are you going to stay? Are you going to obey? Right? And then, you know, while I'm wrestling with that question, I'm thinking about the goodness of God. I'm thinking about his faithfulness. I'm thinking about his love. And even though I can't fully put it into words, there's this understanding that what he has for me is what's best. And one of the things I don't want to do is like, I don't want to be like the Israelites when they were begging for a king, and that inevitably like leads to their downfall, when God is offering to be king of kings. Like he's trying to be your inheritance. He's trying to be your everything, and you're here asking for a lesser version. You're here asking for what is just good enough instead of just inherently good, right? And so I had that conviction. I was like, okay, God, like if you tell me to stay, I'll stay. If this is what you're saying, of course I'm going to submit to you. Like you're my everything. Like you've been everything to me in this whole process, and I'm not going to leave you in the slightest just to go off and do my whole thing, my own thing. And I corrected my heart posture on that day. I was literally on the floor crying. It was not an easy prayer at all, in the slightest. And my mom happened to be watching that day, and she knows like these conversations that I've been having with God. And then, you know, that same day, God is also dealing with me like, hey, fix your heart. Fix your heart there. And so my mom was watching the service on the live stream, and she texted me. She's like, hey, did you hear that? It sounded like God was telling you to go. I was like, no, I feel like God was kind of dealing with me so that I'm okay with staying or something like that. I was like, no, like that's not what I heard. Like that's not what he was saying to me. That's not what I was hearing. Because, you know, in that moment, God was challenging my heart and my attitude there. So keep track of that. And then some time passes by, and God is with me in my secret place. Like I'm having quiet impressions and being able to put words of confirmation to them afterward. And I'm feeling very secure with God, right? And it wasn't until like several weeks later, I felt a word of confirmation that confirmed that, okay, you know what, it actually is time. Like, I give you permission. It is time to go, to move. And I was, this is going to turn out to be so much longer than I was planning on. But I feel like it's important along the lines of this conversation. So I guess this is just going to be a story time that I didn't really plan on. But so anyway, several weeks later, I get this confirmation about like closing one door and going into what's next. And this word of confirmation to me, it confirmed an experience that I had. I remember taking a walk with my daughter. It was like evening. And I was like, God, you dealt with me tenderly, but you did deal with me. And you dealt with my heart. And I actually feel like this is something that you're saying. I feel like you are saying that it's time to move. And I noticed that two things happened. I think this was actually a little bit before or after Christmas. It was around Christmas time. Two things happened. One thing is my vision for the future came back. Like, I had vision for my life. I had vision for growth, and not in the sense of like fulfilling like roles and, doing great and amazing things. It's just, I pictured growth, spiritual growth, emotional growth, mental growth, like any type of like internal growth that you can achieve. Like, that is what I pictured. I pictured family, I pictured ministry, and I pictured like this weight off of me, like being able to live without a weight always on me. And it was a relief. So I had that little experience, and then I came across information that reminded me of my loss. Because again, I'm being present, I'm involved where I am, I'm going through this genuinely, right? And so I'm reminded of my pain pretty often. At least back then I was. And in the second that information came to me, I was like, oh wait, I don't have to hold on to this anymore. I don't have to be offended by this anymore. I don't have to be hurt by this anymore. I loved what was. I loved what I had. I loved where I was. But there's something new now, and I can let this go. And that was like the quickest that I had ever been able to let go of my pain in years. Because again, there's something about staying and remaining that forces you to do a really, really deep work. And that doesn't always mean that you get to avoid the pain of the process. So, but this was like the first moment where I was literally able to like shed it off. Like, it is just relief how quickly I can move on. And so I had that little personal experience. I'm like, this, I really think this is what you're saying. And there's these two different types of fruit that I'm seeing in this possibility, right? And then, a couple weeks later, I have that confirmation that is like, okay, you seem to be like, you're on the right track. And then there was this conference that I went to that just confirmed that God was attentive, receptive, responsive. And he was seeing me. He was not ignoring me. He was not ignoring my need. He really cared. And I'm so sorry for the timeline here, you guys, because I'm trying to mention important details, but I don't think they're necessarily in order. But there's this one word where it was just simply talking about how God was not going to let me die in the wilderness. He was not going to let me die in a season of transition. And so there were a lot of details just about like feeling stuck, wrestling with the idea of like, where is your God? Because you have like nothing to show for it, right? And it was a tough season because even though I considered myself further along in my healing journey, there was this new pain that felt like condemnation. It felt like this is you for the rest of your life. You will always be this broken person because, you know, like this is who you are. Like you're a genuine and authentic person. Yeah, that sounds really great and stuff, but you feel very deeply. And to be here, you have to continue down this line, and there's no way to escape it. So it felt like instead of my pain being like a moment by moment thing, I knew, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, and I don't think this is entirely spiritual. I do think there are spiritual aspects, but it felt like a life sentence, right? And that was kind of the thing that was inciting the prayer of like, God, you have to do this or you have to do that, because I can't be like this forever. I can't stay like this forever, right? And I say, you know, spiritual because I think any spirit of condemnation or any spirit that tells you that you can't do something, especially if it's the will of God, like that needs to be shut up, right? But then there's also practical aspects of like who I am as a person, how I love as a person, how I deal with painful things as a person. I'm empowered to change. I'm empowered to grow. The pain does not have to be intense every single time, but like, you know, just having a balanced perspective of both. And that word about God not leaving me to die, it was accurate, because that season, or I'm going to say that last couple months was the most suicidal I had ever been. And I say that because it wasn't just a thought. It wasn't just an emotion. I was making plans. I was making financial plans for my apartment, plans to write things out, plans to get my finances in order, plans to sell things so that it could be easy and convenient for everyone else involved. That was how bad it was. And so like I'm doing everything I can. I'm getting counseling as often as possible, as often as I can afford it. I'm looking for resources. I'm doing my best as a person. I'm reaching out to my doctor. And I'm praying about it. And so that word was not just an abstract idea like, oh, like God is not leaving you to die. No, literally, God is not leaving you to die in the wilderness. And there were so many parts of that word that I held on to, but what stuck out to me and slightly confused me at the time was like this idea of transition. I'm like, how is this a season of transition? Like that part was a little bit bewildering to me. I think that word about transition was December 4th, if I'm not mistaken. And then the word about obedience was December 10th. So, yeah. Interesting little dynamic there. Okay, and then the word of confirmation that I was getting about, like, hey, no, I think this actually is God. I think God is actually in this, was December 31st. So I found it so interesting. And I have actual like journal entries about this, because as a person, I can be very stubborn. I can be very headstrong. And especially when God is involved, I'm very big on sticking to what he says. Like, to me, it's not a little thing when God speaks. I believe in God. I believe God is real. I believe God speaks. But he doesn't speak all the time. He doesn't speak to just anything. He doesn't speak about things that don't matter. Like, I do not take that for granted. And I treasure that and I hold on to that. So if he cares to say something, I'm going to care to listen. Even when I can't fully explain it or verbalize it or rationalize it. That's just how I am. And so I thought in the season it was very interesting, because all of a sudden, like, I remember having a conversation with my mom, and she's like, kind of like in support of my move and everything. She was like, oh yeah, you know, like this move, it'll be good for you. Like, you'll have like relief and you'll be a little bit more happy. And, you know, I just know that it'll be really good for you. Like, God wants you to be happy. She said something like that. And I was like, this move has nothing to do with that. Like, yes, I agree with what you're saying, but at the end of the day, if, you know, like, there were times that God told me to stay, and it wasn't because he wanted me to be happy. Like, it's so hard to describe, because I'm like, I finally feel permission to leave, right? Or to move, but it has nothing to do with all these like good and rational things that other people would say to support the decision, right? I'm like, at this point, like, because I'm also having to wrestle and be willing to sacrifice too. Like, sometimes God is going to ask you to do things that they aren't going to make you happy, right? And there's a lot about moving in and of itself. There are just different struggles that go along with that, right? So I'm like, if God says to go, yeah, there are advantages, but there's also disadvantages. And if God says to stay, there are advantages, but there are also disadvantages. So it was so weird how I was like balancing throughout that process. And I just thought it was so funny how, like, for a long time when people would be like, oh yeah, you know, you should move, it's what's best for you. I'm like, okay, well, God told me to stay, so I'm staying. And then even now when people are, you know, their opinions haven't changed. They still think it's good for me, right? But I'm like, okay, yeah, but like, just understanding the sacrifice attached to it, and being willing to sacrifice. That was like a big thing for me. And I just thought that was funny, because I also have like journal entries just about the whole thing, where like 1 minute I'm really, really strong about something, but the second I feel like God is shifting me in a different direction, that's what I want to do. An example of that was when, I think it was when I started like family planning. And for a long time, I was like, nah, I'm a career-oriented woman. I do not only want to be a housewife. I do not only want to be a stay-at-home mom. Like, I want other things going for me. Like, I'm ambitious. I am an ambitious person. I want to go off and be great and do things, right? And then when I was pregnant, that feeling changed. And my priorities for family changed. I was like, if it's at all possible to be a stay-at-home mom, I think I want that. Like, I think I want my main ministry to be marriage and family. Like, I want to do this. I want to do this well. I want to glorify God by being a stay-at-home mom. And that is not a rational, logical thing that I can explain. I can't fully explain why that shift happened. It was just something that I was believing that God was saying. And that's pretty much the only other example I can come up with. But in the months that followed, right? Because even in this yes that I'm perceiving from God, I'm still being careful to watch over my mind and to watch over my heart. And even though I'm confident in my relationship with God, in my knowledge of God, in my devotional time with God, enough to share this word with others, there's still a part of me that's, I'm human. I can make mistakes. And this whole thing is new to me. This is the first time I'm doing something this, it seems to be drastic in my eyes, and I'm doing it alone. But I feel confident enough to share. And in the months that followed, it was super weird what happened. I started questioning. Here's the thing. I'm not very transparent. I don't tell everybody deep emotional things. I don't tell everybody sensitive things. But I had gotten to a point where at this point in my process, I had gotten 3 signals that this was God and this is what he was saying. One of them I forgot to share with you guys, but I think that actually comes like later in the story. But there was a point in this new year, right? Because I got, God was speaking to me and answering me, responding to me, dealing with me in December, right? And there was this moment where I felt like God told me to go back and watch the service from December 10th when I was on the floor and when he was dealing with me. He said, go back, listen to it, and you'll have the confirmation that I am telling you to leave. And remember, this is the day that my mom said, oh, it sounds like God's telling you to go. I'm like, nah, God was just dealing with me on the floor, telling me, asking me if I'm willing to sacrifice this again, if it's what he's saying. So anyway, so I kind of heard that word in my personal time, like, go back, watch the service, listen again. And there's a segment where the speaker is talking about like how they thought they would be in one place forever, like for the rest of their lives. Like that's where their vision was. And then God asked them, like, what would you do if I told you to move? And when I came across that little snippet there, I was like, oh my gosh, my mom was right. And then I called her and I was like, hey, Mom, I'm sorry. I did not hear that the first time. Like, that was not how I was being ministered to. That was not how I was being ministered to that day. But God highlighted that to me now. And he gave me ears to hear it now. And I think that's what he's saying now. So that was kind of like an additional signal for me. But anyway, I really started learning to hear God after the age of 18, after coming to know him as a father and my perception of him and his character no longer being determined by the earthly fathers and the earthly men that I knew. Instead, it was based on him for who he is and his word and all that. And so especially from like 2018 onward, that has always been an area of growth for me. I was not raised to know that I had direct access to God like that, where I can speak to him and he can respond. And prayers, it's not this one-way conversation. It's a two-way relationship, a two-way dynamic. The intimacy is going both ways, right? But to this day, that's still an area of growth for me because, before I'm filtering, at the very beginning, well, that was more so like in high school. In the very beginning, I was like, okay, this is the voice of the enemy and this is me, right? Then it shifted to like, okay, this is me. This is the voice of the enemy. This is me agreeing with a person. This is the voice of God, and then watching my heart, watching my mind, right? Now in this season, it's like, what is the voice of God? And what is the, what's it called? The counterfeit. Like, what sounds like God but isn't actually coming from God, right? And so I had personal, because, okay, here's the thing, which I actually remember sharing this to a friend. When God, there have been like certain moments where I have given God ultimatums. And I said, either you do this or you do that. One of them was in 2018, where for a long time in my personal time with God, I felt like God was saying to join the worship team. And I was like, I don't really want to join the worship team. I don't want to attract attention to myself. I'm not sure that these people really like me like that. I don't think that they would support me. They don't really know me. They might think I'm doing it for self-seeking reasons. I don't really want to have to fight people to obey you, or defend myself or advocate for myself or anything like that. It was just like an overall impression I had. Not saying that was the culture or the character of the people involved. It was just, I don't know, it was a feeling for me. And then I got confirmation when I was in Florida. I was at the special service. This guy comes up. He's like, hey, that push you feel toward the altar, that's coming from God. And when I got back home, I just felt resistance when I was trying to step into what God was calling me to do, whether it was to pray for a person, encourage a person. I was like, if I step out, I feel like there's going to be pushback. And something along that lines ended up happening. And that was what led to the conditions that I prayed about. Like, God, either, you tell everybody that this is what you're telling me to do, or you give me permission to not do this. Because I was very anxious. I cared very much about what people would say, what people would think. And if I was going to step out and do what God called me to do and be confident in doing that, like, I wanted everyone to know that this was God and not me. And then later that same weekend, that's exactly what happened. Like, I get pulled out from the very, very back corner shadow where I like to hide, and then I'm brought up to the altar, and then this is a similar thing. Like, this is where God has you. This is what God wants. This is what you're supposed to do. Because at that point, I had already vocalized my interest or intention to join the worship team, but nothing was like finalized. It was all just kind of like a conversation. And then something happened. I felt pushback. I got scared. I got anxious. I'm like, God, you have to literally go before me and do this. And then he did it. So again, not the point of the story, but I'm just trying to establish the context of the kind of relationship I have with God. I had felt enough security in my history to share this with people, even though it was still something very delicate. And when it was brought into question, there was a part of me, again, I'm a balanced person. I'm big on balance over here. So I was like, okay, I'm okay with resistance. I'm okay with people not entirely understanding or agreeing. I'm okay with people being skeptical. There is a chance I could be wrong. There is a chance I could be misled. But there was something about the undertone that was like, wait, like, I know who I am. But like over the years, I've been very careful to make sure that the enemy had no hooks in me, like no way to trap me in bitterness or like hopelessness. Like there were things that I did to make sure that I was always able to see God in my process, to depend on God when I was at my last limit. right? My most recent crisis even considered in that statement. Like, I have still always been the type to submit to God when I feel like he's saying something, or when I feel like he's saying not to do something. It doesn't matter how big or small it is. And so I was considering that, and I'm like, okay, but wait, I've also, in addition to keeping watch over my heart and my mind, I've also feel like I've tangibly heard from God, like in ways that I wouldn't think to have figured out for myself. Like, he brought them to my attention. I think this is real. And then I'm seeing fruit of it in application. Like, I'm seeing the way I'm really able to let go. Like, I really am able to forget the past. Like, that's not just an abstract idea anymore. I'm empowered to do it in a way I've never been able to do it before. I have vision for the future, and the vision is not any self-seeking thing, and it's not just me running away, because I literally had a moment before all this where I was like, God, I will obey you. Like, as much as I like to talk and as much as I like to make demands, like, if you say it, I want it, because what you have is what's best for me, even if I can't understand it. And, you know, I think back to like these stories of, like even that Bible story of Stephen, where he's being stoned for his faith, but in that moment where he's literally being persecuted, they're literally killing him, and his eyes are so fixed on Jesus, and he's telling them to forgive the people who are hurting him. Like, even if it's goodness in a way that I can't understand or comprehend, I want what God wants, right? So I'm like, okay, there's this knowledge of me and who I am. Then there's this knowledge of God. Then there's these like signals and stuff like that. And spiritually, and I mean spiritually because I don't like, how do I explain this? For months, questioning God in this season and in this way, questioning God, questioning myself, it shattered. Like, this was, I don't know how to explain this. Have you guys ever seen like those movies where like there's like, okay, like there's like a timeline, right? And if you change this one thing, you break it. Like, you break it. You broke it. It's gone. It felt like questioning this specific thing again, questioning God, questioning me, questioning my history, questioning the way that I felt that God was leading me. It almost broke my relationship with God entirely, because all of this has been tied to obeying God in everything. Obeying God enough to stay, obeying God, and how do I explain this? There was this one situation in 2021 where I felt like God was telling me to move churches, right? And I was married at the time, and my husband wasn't getting the memo. I was like, I think God is telling me to move. I feel like I'm supposed to move churches. I think this is what God is saying. I'm like, I don't think this is going to go over well. And this is really not the season to be making a big jump like this. But I think God is in this. I think this is what God's saying. And then I personally had a word, like a prophetic word of someone saying like, hey, you know, I see you looking around at all these houses, and I'm getting this sensation that you're not settled where you are, and God is calling you to move. And you know, I don't think it has to do with like literally moving houses. I think you're, you know, almost like a spiritual house, like a spiritual church. I think God is telling you to move. And, you know, so it's like insight like that, confirmation like that, already echoing something that I was feeling from God personally. Like, that is how God has been teaching me and discipling me and hearing him. And then I was like, okay, well, God, like now I'm having this conversation. I'm like, I need a sign that this is really you. And then I felt like I was in Florida at the time. So it was either April or May 2021. I was in Florida, and I felt like I was like, something's going to happen in June. And that is going to be a signal to you. That's how you're going to know that that is where you're going. That's the place where I want you to go. And in June, I believe that was around the time where announcements were made that the church that I was planning on going to was changing its like brand name, and, you know, combining in a vision and mission with this other church that I had formerly been a part of. So I was like, huh, okay. So that's my history with God. That's an example of my history with God. And questioning this one thing, especially with such a big decision, it was almost like you break this, you break everything. And then all of a sudden, my thoughts were like, you know how you stayed all those years? You know how you were in pain and you were suffering all those years? Yeah, that was your own fault. That was your own doing. You did that to yourself. That wasn't God. That wasn't you obeying God. That was all you being crazy. You know, thoughts like that. Like, that's how it started, like, growing inside of me. Like, doubting that one thing. Like, all of a sudden, there are a bunch of weeds in my garden. And I remember even... this is such a sad story, and I'm not gonna be too specific, divulging information that's not mine, but I walked with a very dear friend of mine going through similar life-changing situations where she's struggling in her marriage. She just has a kid, and now she's going back home, and, you know, there are a lot of tough emotions there. And there was a point where I had been brought to weeping in the same familiar way I had wept in the past before. And I asked God, I was like, God, how come you didn't give me permission to leave? How come I had to stay? And then those thoughts are coming up, like, you did that to yourself. Like, you are your own fault there. Like, and then, so all of a sudden, I'm like, no, like, now I'm wrestling with, like, if I was misled, God, how could you let me be misled for so long? Like, this is who I am. This is who you are. This is how I've known you. This is how I've been learning you. This is how I've been hearing you. How could you let me be misled for so long? Because now it's not just about the last couple months, the last 4 months, the last year. It's about the last, 5 years where I needed God the most. Right? And for this one little thing, is like, I don't know if that makes sense, because I can't give, this is like the first time something like this happens to me, but just the onslaught of damaging and destructive thoughts that I was wrestling with, of all of a sudden not being sure of who God is, not being sure of who I am. It was messing with my attitude. And I was like, okay, I am okay with being wrong. I want to make that very clear. I am not too proud to say that I tried and failed. Like, I feel like that is a part of everything that I'm doing with the podcast, with my website, as a mom, like, everything pretty much. Like, I am doing my best. I have high standards for myself, but I fail and I mess up. And if you're not willing to fail, you're not willing to learn, you're not willing to grow. Like, that's just how I am. That's how I am as a person. And, but for months, seeing how this doubt almost brought destruction to everything was what showed me that this is actually spiritual. Like, this is not, I cannot agree with the thought that is destroying my intimacy with God. I cannot agree with the thought that is causing me to question myself when I take such very special care of my mind and my heart. I cannot entertain a thought that is making me question God and God's good character and God's intention for me. And so I had to have this moment where I literally decided to take the thought captive and stop doubting and have confidence in my God, who is my Father and my counselor and my friend and my Lord and my Savior and my director. Like, he, especially ever since I made a very new vow to him, like, he is my husband, he's the head of my house. I can't, like, if this thought is going to pull me away from him, I'm going to forsake that thought. And, like, if I am wrong at the end of all this, then I'm just going to trust that he will fix me whenever and wherever that becomes needed, because I have to trust him, and I have to be confident in who I am as a daughter. I have to believe that he's real, and that he's real enough to step in, real enough to make his voice known, his will known. And I have to believe that I have access for myself, right? So that became, I wanted to share that as like an example of like a way to discern voices. That's kind of like what I'm trying to highlight, is that it's so easy. It is so easy to be misled by yourself, by others, and by demonic spirits. And holding yourself captive to like the truth of the Word of God, and learning to listen and learning to discern, like that is not easy at all. That is not an easy process. And after overcoming that one obstacle, all of a sudden there's new obstacles that I'm having to wrestle with in my mind now. Like different, thoughts are voices. Like a thought is a voice. A thought is speaking words. So after that point, it was all of a sudden like, okay, now my mind has to be renewed, because now like I feel like it opened my eyes to spiritual influences I wasn't aware of before. One was a massive one of just being insecure. Like, you are not good at being confident when no one else believes in you. You are very sensitive to what your people think. Not what everyone thinks, but what your people think. Even when it stands against what you think God is saying. And then all of a sudden, like, things that are obvious to me, because I don't have rose-colored glasses on, like, I'm aware of the struggles, all of a sudden there's more being added to that. Like, you're going to lose everyone. You're going to lose everything. If something wrong happens, you are utterly alone now. Like, you are literally alone now. You're throwing everything that you've used to survive, everything that you've had to survive, the people, the resources, they're gone if you make this decision. And then all of a sudden I had to wrestle with the weight of like, if you know everything that you're going to lose now, are you still going to do it? Are you still going to obey? Because even a transition, like moving from Florida to North Carolina, I had rose-colored glasses on back then. I'm like, we're going to go follow God. We're going to go do what God is doing. This is where God is leading. We had never gotten like verbal confirmation until we had actually made plans to make the move, and it was already like official. We're like, everything's going to go great. We're going to go do what God says. Everything's going to be perfect. We're not going to struggle. We're not going to be in pain. I was like just surprised that I ended up missing my family as much as I did. I did not realize how family oriented I actually was, and not being around them in addition to adjusting as a new wife, like that was a lot for me. We were, technically without our own home for a long time. We were struggling financially. I'm adjusting in my identity as a wife. That is not, to me, that was not easy. It was a lot. There was a lot of struggles there. Struggles I didn't foresee. And now, as a older, slightly more wiser person, I can anticipate things now. And now I'm seeing my potential losses ahead of time. And now I'm wrestling with the conviction of like, okay, knowing everything you're going to lose. And knowing that there's a chance that you could be wrong. You're still going to obey God. And then pretty much from like May onward, like I started wrestling with that thought, because I'm like, I actually really don't know. Like, I think I might, even if there's a chance, no. How do I say that? with the amount of conviction I have that this is really God, there is a chance that I might willingly disobey him. Because I love what I have. I love the familiarity. I love the comfort. I love the people. I love that I'm already involved, invested. I already have a tribe, you know. I feel safe. I don't know if I'm willing to risk all that. All the pain of the process considered, all the suffering of the process considered, everything that I dealt with before considered, obviously. Still don't know if I would leave that to obey God. And, you know, that was like its own little process for the next several months. And I actually asked people, there were two things I prayed, that God would either confirm it to everybody else or give me the boldness and audacity to actually go and do what I think he's telling me to do. And I would cry and I would weep because I really thought this might be one of the only times that I can remember where I'm literally going to choose to disobey ahead of time. Like, this is about to be like what's it called? A premeditated situation over here. And I'm thankful that I made the move. Thankful for that. But the point that I'd really love to make, and this is where I'm trying to bring it all home and all together, is I don't know you on the other end of this. Like, I don't know who you are. I don't know what your name is. I don't know what your relationship with God is like. But I do want you to know that it is possible to hear God, and it's possible to be his, like his child, his sheep. It's possible to be his enough to a point where you are familiar with his voice. And if there's something that I'm trying to say with my story, it's that, like, everyone could be saying what God eventually says at one point, right? But until God says it, you know, be the person that doesn't turn or move or look away until God says so. Like, that's something that I found was like so profound, like with that video that I was sharing before, is that like these people are all saying the same message. Like, eventually all of them are saying, come, 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 come. Or in my case, move, 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 right? But it's not until God says something, you know, that our hearts should be nudged, that our heads should turn, that our, you know, attention should be fixed in the direction that he's saying to go, right? I thought that was really, really beautiful. And then even like the part where the shepherd is not even saying to come inherently, but he's just starting by mumbling, whispering nothing. He's talking, but he's not saying to come yet. He's just trying to get your attention, right? And that was something that I noticed from August to December of 2023, was that there were so many breadcrumbs that were like shifting my attention. And I want to encourage you, like, to seek that out for yourself. And like if you don't know God at all, I just want you to know that it's, you know, it's possible to have God, to have access to him, to have a relationship with him, to have a prayer life where there is an actual dynamic of you saying something and him saying something, there's, an ability to grow in discernment when you're learning not just what he says, but how he says it, when he says it. And if you're already a Christian, right, and you don't have this relationship with God, there's so much more that I want. There's so much more intimacy that I want, so much more access that I want. I want to grow in like holiness and righteousness so that I can, have more intimacy with Jesus. Like, I think that's like uncapped potential. Like, we can be growing in that forever. But at the very least, like bare minimum, like super, super foundational knowledge is that you can grow in your identity enough to simply be a child of God, like a daughter of God. And you can be his sheep. And being his sheep is like a privilege. Like, to me, that was just like, it was just such a beautiful picture of seeing how his people respond to him. Like, his people, like, they pause in his presence. They pause in his presence. When he has something to say, we're pausing. We're stopping what we're doing. We're listening. And when he says, come, we should come. Anyway, I hope that, parts of that story resonated. I hope that it was interesting. I hope that it was helpful. And I hope that it makes you want to hear God for yourself. You are his sheep. You are his. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you guys so much for listening. Feel free to DM me to send me your feedback. Check out the description below to follow me on social media. This podcast is listener supported. Don't forget to subscribe. Remember, you are fully known and deeply loved. I'll see you in the next one.